So these are going to be some of my thoughts on becoming a orphan, which at the age of 49, having both my parents die, that's actually pretty decent on the grand scheme of things. I mean, I knew my parents for a long time. We had a long, happy time together. They had a very long, happy time together. But it can be useful to reflect on these things. Useful life lessons and all that sort of thing. And my mum and my dad died in very different ways. My dad died of liver cancer, and the reason I didn't do something like this when he died is on the off chance that my mum found it online. It's unlikely she would have done, but if she had, it would have upset her. And now that there's no one left to upset like that, I can be fairly frank about the how things went down. So with my dad, he died of a form of liver cancer, and about 5 years ago now, getting 6. And I remember going back one Christmas, and he was feeling a bit off. Like this was different off. This wasn't just your regular kind of sick. It was, all shaky and all that sort of thing. And so. I go through the sort of symptoms he has, and it looks like his sugar regulation's all messed up, and sorts of points to something fairly serious like pancreatic cancer. At which point, he said, "Well, that's it. He's dead in 6 months then." Now, as it turns out, it wasn't pancreatic cancer. It was a single large cancer in his liver, but they all sort of meet down here in the bile duct area, which tends to be what kills you in the end. And the 6-month thing turned out to be brutally accurate. It's almost exactly 6 months after that he died. But he was probably treatable. But it was a borderline thing. The thing is with a lot of these cancers is they clearly go into the pile of clearly not treatable, clearly treatable. His was somewhere in the middle. But when you bear in mind that with things like liver cancer, 5-6 of them aren't treatable. He was fairly lucky to be in the board. He had a single large tumour, bloody huge, this sort of size. But it was only once it started squeezing on the bile duct that he started exhibiting symptoms. Now, had the NHS had their arse in, there were so many things that the NHS just, that's the health service in England, they were just slow. And this is one of the ones where, being slow basically transitions you from being borderline treatable to not treatable, which is kind of what happened. And my dad was fairly pissed off about that. There were these things where they would, he would go to see the doctor and they say, you need this scan, it's MRI or CT scan, blah, blah, blah. And then nothing would happen. And eventually you had to call them up and, we'll book you in sometime. And eventually we just gave up with all of that and we went and got it done privately. And it was still going to be borderline even if it had been a month earlier. But like I was saying, he was in this sort of borderline category. But after we got the scans, then it was pushing on this venous cava or something. It's a big artery that goes down the back of your liver, artery, vein. And if you're squeezing that as well, then cutting it out becomes difficult. So, then it went over to chemo drugs on the basis that, they weren't quite sure what sort of cancer it was, and you sort of hold off on doing a biopsy because biopsies can sort of, potentially spread the cancer. But, the cancers inherit the sort of properties of the cells of the organs that they originally come from. So if it's a sort of bowel cancer that's metastasized to the liver, then you can treat these things better. Whereas if it's pancreatic cancer that's gone anywhere else, then you're screwed. And they were never really entirely sure what sort of cancer it was. And he got on the chemo drugs, but by that time he was really squeezing his bile duct, and with that blocked, he died dead within a couple of months less, that sort of thing. And it wasn't until the day before he died, there's this thing called pastoral care, which is basically when you go home to die. And there had been hope up until that point that, if we unblock his bile duct, chemo drugs have some effect on the cancer. It's still a single large cancer. It's still potentially, with liver regrowth, you can just chop half of the liver out and you're not so bad. But the day before, and this is the other thing with my dad, he was completely with it the whole way through, sharp as a knife. Me and my dad were two peas in a pod, in that we would frequently talk about the stuff he was doing with his research. He had a keen interest in World War II, as did I. So we were very close, me and my dad. And it's the day before, when it was clear that this was, there wasn't really any hope anymore. He was dead. He died the next day. He was actually in a coma on the last day. So after he got the news, we got the call early the next morning that we should come quickly. So me, my brother, and my mum, we were all with him when he died, holding his hand, telling him nice stories, all that sort of thing. You can't tell whether, I don't know whether he heard anything, but it was traumatic to do, but I'm glad that I did it. And the same is true of my brother and my mum. But even before he died, sort of 6 months beforehand, me and my dad had sort of gone through the sort of contingency plans with me about, given that, even if it's just liver cancer, and you're in for a sort of 1 in 6 chance of dying in the next 6 months, so it's prudent to make some plans. And there were two things. Wanted to make sure the house would have been good for my mum to live in for a significant period of time. It was in a fairly good state of repair, but he'd also noticed that my mum's memory was getting very bad, that was severely aggravated. Stress and such like aggravated this. And I'd noticed this very much whilst I was, every day I would drive my mum in to see my dad in hospital. In the last 2 weeks or so. Up until about then, actually, my dad had still been writing papers. He was sort of sharp as a knife, right up until the end. That bit where I gave him the hug on the last day. He was completely with it. But the stress aggravated my mum's mental decline, and also it's one of those things that if you're in a familiar environment, especially if you've got a partner there, they can sort of compensate around you, and it's not as big a problem as if you have to live on your own all of a sudden. With my mum, it certainly aggravated her problems, and a path to hell is paved with good intentions. So my mum would have been all alone in a big empty house, and so we got her what was meant to be a teacup poodle. Unfortunately, this wasn't a teacup poodle, and it grew to real dog sizes. This thing wasn't meant to get any bigger than this. The sort of thing that an old woman could take care of. And my dad was 75 at the time. My mum, same age. but the teacup poodle, yeah, just kept growing and growing and growing. The problem was that my mum had kind of got attached to it, and couldn't just get rid of it. Even though, this would have been arguably worth doing, but anyway, so came the day that the dog just ran off after something and pulled her over and broke her arm, which and this was about a year after my dad died, and it took her a long time. It took her 6 months to get over that, and she lost a lot of mobility whilst recovering from that. After that, of course, we got rid of the dog, which kind of sucked. But by this time, my mum's memory was getting really bad, and she could cope okay as long as she was in a familiar environment, and we tried to get me and my brother tried to get get a brain scan. See, it had the feel of dementia or Alzheimer's, something like that. None of these brain rot things you can do a lot about. It's you can maybe slow them down a bit, but there are other things that you can maybe do stuff about, and that's why it's useful to get these things done. And so me and my brother, we adapted the house such that she could live in it. We took the odd. Before my dad had died, when it was clear this might be the end, we all took a sort of family holiday together at one of these it's called Centre Parks. It's a sort of family retreat type thing. Not much for old folks to do there, but my dad, he was just happy to be there with the family. And so we did a couple of those with my mum, which she kind of enjoyed. But her mental decline became much more visible about 2 years ago. This was, I would call her up on a regular basis, once a week, that sort of thing. And we would talk, and it was mostly the same conversation, but I got to talk to her, see if anything was new, see if anything needed doing. And she would start getting confused between, she would ask me strange questions like, was I in the next room? Or, things that were signs that her reality was starting to break down. And also, dementia doesn't just rot your memory, it does other things as well, like, how to describe this? Usually you have a sort of fairly analog response to certain things, like you're happy with it or you're not happy with it, you're angry. And you have a fairly graded response between very happy, very angry. That compresses down as you lose some of your cognitive ability, such that you can flip very quickly between happy and angry. And it's getting more and more of that. So she would tell us constantly that she wanted to throw stuff out of the house, and then when we would go to help her throw stuff out of the house, she would want to sort through it all, and when we would sort of say, we've got a limited amount of time to do this, she would flip to don't pressure me, don't pressure me. So these were the early signs that of things being wrong. And eventually we did get a scan done, and it might have been hydrocephalus, which is basically you get fluid accumulation in the brain, and it squeezes your brain, and this affects your ability to do things, which is maybe treatable with some success. You stick a stent into the brain and let the fluid drain out into the body cavity, I think. But anyway, that was maybe treatable, but again, it was, by the time we got the diagnosis done, this time I can't blame anyone else. This was, well, and my mum was really stubborn about going to see the doctor. Uh, so it's about 2 years ago that we went for this last holiday together, and I had been really concerned in that she would get confused whether, when I was calling from Prague, whether I was in the house or not, or she would say things that clearly weren't true, that my brother had been there earlier. What she actually meant is she'd talked to my brother. And when we went on this holiday together, it was clear that she was it was almost suicidal, her living on her own. There were that week, at the end of the week, there were some friends coming over for a meal, and this just completely preoccupied her mind for the whole week we were on this sort of vacation. And so the hope was that I would go back to Prague, and she could make, I didn't want her to lose her independence. And hoped that we could find somewhere nice by Christmas. By the time I got back to Prague, I called her up and she was talking about people coming and taking things out of the house. And like I was saying, when things are constant, it's not so obvious that something's wrong. But I think because we'd taken her on this sort of vacation and brought her back again, everything was completely in tatters. And I flew back to England the same day because I was that concerned. And when we talked to her friends and family, they all, every single one of them agreed that it was crazy her living alone. So that's when we put her in a home. And it's about 6 months after that we had our last real family Christmas. My mum had lost most of her mobility. She still recognised us, which was nice, and we sang carols together. We had a family dinner at the home, and it was the last thing that, and this for me, I think was one of the golden moments, is she wanted to go home. Now, going home wasn't practical on any sensible level. Most of all, there was the practical killer from the start, is that she couldn't go upstairs, and the house you had to go upstairs to get into the house. But we did some, we went out to a coffee shop, had some food, and we did a lot of sort of things together. And on one of them, coming back, she said she wanted to go via the house. And for me, it was, was this going to make her happy or sad or angry? You didn't really know. But so I drove her past the house. It's just me and my mum in the car. And she was absolutely overjoyed. It's like, oh, I can see that. It's like a little kid again. It's like, I can see that. So I remember this bit. I remember this. And so I drove around the house, and she was very happy about that, which was nice. Anyway, within about 3 months after that, she kind of stopped. She knew my voice. She knew it was familiar, but she started losing touch there. But the doctors, by the way, earlier, they decided it wasn't hydrocephalus. It was a variant of brain rot, dementia mixed with Alzheimer's, something. It's your autoimmune system basically starts rotting away your brain, which, and these earlier things that you'd noticed, that there's this flip between emotional states. This gets more and more pronounced, and within about 6 months of the last Christmas together, it was actually quite stressful talking to her on the phone, in that she would, first of all, it was hard to get her to concentrate on where the sound was coming from, and she would flip, between sort of shouting at people who were just there. She was confused whether it was where the voice was coming from and all that sort of thing. And the next Christmas, of course, I couldn't go home because of COVID. And even if I could have gone home, I wouldn't have been allowed in the home because of COVID. And my brother, in the meantime, he'd managed to see her a couple of times, both of which were very stressful. In that, whilst your mum is still there, she's still physically there, and her voice is the same. It took her a long time to recognise him, if indeed she truly recognised him. And the last time he went to see her, your ability to this is an irony actually, that he wouldn't have been allowed to see her in the home, but because she'd stopped drinking stuff, or she hadn't been drinking enough, and if you don't drink enough, your salt balance goes hypernatremia or something. It's basically your salt levels go crazy, and this is because your ability to associate drinking with what quenches thirst also rots away. And so she hadn't been drinking enough, and they took her into hospital, and the reckoning was, well, we can, you just hook her up to a saline drip and you rehydrate her that way. And my brother went to see her there, and I joined in with these things via a Skype call. And that was very traumatic. And it was about 2 months after that, they rehydrated her. I woke up and the first message was like 2 a.m. that your mum's needs some pain medication or something, and there's another message 4 hours later, and she's died. Which, this was completely different from my dad. With my dad, it was, I was talking to him the day before, and he was incredibly stoic about it all. I mean, right down from the first moment he hears, it's like, oh, well, dead in 6 months. And to the day before, that was arguably the time when, he basically decided that, what was the point going home to die? But with my mum, she just sort of faded away. And I was actually, with my dad, he was incredibly raw with the funeral, because, the week before we'd been talking together, everything had been very interactive. But with my mum, I hadn't interacted with her in a sort of meaningful way for almost 2 years. And the last time I had seen her had been really, really traumatic. There'd been, it's almost a sort of living dead element to it, that she's there, but she's not there. Physically, it's still your mum, it's her voice. Actually, by this time, she'd physically changed a lot, but But the interesting thing was, so I was dreading the funeral of my mum much more, because I thought, these would be the memories that would come back, but during her sort of remembrance. So you've got to choose these things for the funeral, like some music. You've got me and my brother, we were both the ones who were going to speak at the funeral, and the thing is that all the recent memories of my mum had been fairly unpleasant ones. But interestingly enough, between actually writing my mum had an interesting life, in that she was born in Rangoon, so this is then Burma, and during the early days of World War II, and I got this story of her sister. Her sister was 7 at the time, and their dad was in the army, so that's why they were there. And yeah, it's just one of the most fantastically gripping things that I've ever heard in my life. Was talking to her sister. Her sister was this was years ago, so her sister was, I don't know, 70 at the time or something. But when she was 7, she had good ears, and she was the first one who could hear the Japanese bombers coming. And she described this is the sort of graphic stories that you remember when you're 7, when people are trying to kill you. They ran out of the house, and there was a trench dug outside the house for them to hide in the air raids. And she saw the bombers coming in. A nice line of bombers, completely unopposed, because there was nothing to fight them. So, bombing is very easy when you're just completely unopposed, straight level fly, drop the bombs when you want, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, so she describes they all ran out, they hid in the trenches, and she recalled actually watching the bombs drop off the planes. And they were all knocked unconscious by the blast, and her sister was the first one to come to. Well, not the first one. When she came to, my mum, who was 2 years old at the time, was crying. So she had sort of evidently been the only one who remained blown unconscious by the blast. And then they went back into the house, and it had been completely peppered with shrapnel, and the staircase that took them upstairs was completely destroyed. And they were flown out of Burma on an American flying fortress that had been stripped of all of its stuff, all of its weaponry, and was just being used as a transport. And she didn't come back to England until she was about 7. So yeah, and she had a love of animals and the such like, and lots of things creepy crawly, and that's what everyone remembered about her. So going over the happy points of her life and some of the music that she loved, is the music to All Creatures Great and Small, which was a English sort of drama type thing that she enjoyed watching about a vet and his adventures in, I don't know, the rural areas of England. But it had very light, whimsical music that very much summarised my mum. And so we played that at her funeral, twice as it turns out, once in the middle and once at the end, which I thought was, at the time I wasn't quite sure whether this was lazy, but in the end, no, it turned out to be fantastic, because it was such a song that reminded me of my mum when she was young and happy and liked things like that. So, and also, on the way to the remembrance service, they built my mum's body for the house, which I know she would have liked that. And so her and my dad, they were together for their whole lives. Now their ashes are sat on top of each other, so should be happy by that. But anyway, so I just wanted to go through this because it's this contrast of death comes to us all, whether we haste or delay, and only 2 things in life are certain: death and taxes. And 2 very different ways to die. One where you're completely with it to the point where you can play and beat people at chess on the day before you die, and the other one where you essentially die by slices, which kind of sucks. But anyway, so I was actually trotting my mum's funeral, but in the end, it worked out. She would have been happy with it, and I ended up with happy memories of my mum, which was good. Anyway, so those are just my thoughts on that. Sorry I rambled a bit there. Hope you found it useful. Okay.